Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehudit in South Carolina. Stop skipping. In South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck. Joe, sounds like you're not getting sound, but I think I'm on. Hopefully everybody else is getting it. Maybe try refreshing if you can hear me. Chaim in Florida, Ella and Nancy in North Carolina over there on the YouTube side. And Beth, dig a well. Very good. That's thinking outside the box when we get to the dilemma of two guys stranded in the desert who only have enough water for one. We are continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 5 in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're talking about the prohibition, written Torah prohibition on lending to your fellow Jew at interest. That's by Torah law clearly. If you would agree to a loan that when it was repaid would be repaid with more money than was lent, that's just classic interest. And that is for sure a violation of Torah law. And then the Mishnah gives 2 other examples where we start to get into the area of rabbinic law, where it's not so obvious that it's interest. For example, if I can borrow a bushel of wheat today and I'll pay you back a bushel of wheat in a week or two, can become a problem because the price of wheat could increase during that time period. And then there's a more complicated example in the Mishnah where somebody pays today, agrees to take delivery of wheat in the future, and then before he actually gets the wheat delivered, they agree on what the wheat is worth. And then apply sort of that credit toward buying wine. And in this kind of double exchange, the price has appreciated, and that would end up being a violation of this prohibition, but perhaps not by Torah law, rather by rabbinic decree, because it's that more attenuated example which could amount to a violation of lending at interest, and it certainly violates the rabbinic decree that the rabbis created to protect us from coming to violate the Torah law. We also have these 2 terms, neshech, interest, and ribis, increase, where ribis describes these more less obvious cases of it amounts to interest, but because there's some kind of increase in the value of what was borrowed and then what is going to be paid back. Okay, so we pick this up on page 61b, about 2/3 of the way down, I would say on 61b. So the Mishnah teaches, our Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 5, and which is tarbit. It is the case of one who enters into a transaction that yields an increase in produce beyond his investment. How so? And by the way, I said ribis. Here it says tarbit, but tarbit is a cognate, a kind of a different syntax, but the same root word as ribis or ribbit, which is how we're typically referring to this kind of issue in Talmudic parlance. So, how so? For example, a case where one acquired wheat from another at the price of 1 core of wheat for 1 gold dinar. Right? So we made a deal. You're gonna give me a core of wheat. I'm gonna give you 1 gold dinar. But the wheat is to be supplied at a later date. So I'm giving you the money today, and you're going to give me the wheat at a later date. And such was the market price of wheat at the time that he acquired it, right? This was the right price. We made an agreement at the market price. The price of 1 core of wheat then increased and stood at 30 dinars. The gold dinar, I guess, is worth 24 silver dinars, right? And so now the price went up to 30 silver dinars. So at that point, the buyer said to the seller, "Give me all of my wheat now, as I wish to sell it and purchase wine with it." And the seller said to him, "Since it is ultimately wine that you want, not wheat, so each core of your wheat is considered by me to be worth 30 dinars, right? So the appreciated price, not the original price. And you have the right to collect its value in wine from me." So in this case, the seller did not have wine in his possession. And the Gemara asks, is that to say that all these cases that we said in the Mishnah until now are not cases of interest? And Rabbi Bahu says, until here, i.e. the first 2 cases in our Mishnah, the Mishnah was referring to cases of interest that are violations of Torah law. And from this point forward in our Mishnah, meaning this third and more complicated example, the Mishnah is referring to cases of interest by rabbinic law. So if the lender does not explicitly stipulate that the debtor must pay a sum greater than the value of the loan, they do not violate the Torah prohibition of interest, but the sages prohibited doing so, right? So in other words, if I say to you, one idea is I will lend you a bushel of wheat today and you will pay me back a bushel of wheat next week. So when we make this deal, what's the problem, right? We're talking about, what is it? I forget which one I said, but I'm going to lend you a bushel of wheat and you're going to pay me back in a week. So what I'm giving you is worth the same as what you're going to give me at the time that we are agreeing to it, right? So there's definitely no violation of Torah law. The sages issued the rabbinic decree that you can't do this because the price might go up over the course of the week. And then when the bushel of wheat is returned, it will be worth more than what was originally borrowed. And that's why it would create an interest problem. And so it was the rabbis, by their decree, protecting us from entering into that transaction. Right? So remember, at the time that we agreed to it, doesn't sound like a problem, at least by Torah law, but the sages said no, because it could become a problem. Right? If we knew, for example, that the price will be higher next week, if we knew that for a fact, then at the time that we entered into the agreement, we would have already violated the Torah law. But since we don't all know the future, it wouldn't violate the Torah law at the time of entering into the agreement. Okay. So the Gemara comments, in the cases in the Mishnah, until here, meaning the ones by Torah law, there is a fulfillment of the verse that the wicked may prepare and the righteous shall dawn, from Job 27:17. And this is interpreted as referring to the case of a wicked father who collects interest from borrowers. And upon inheriting the father's estate, his righteous son is not obligated to return the interest to the borrower. After all, the son did not trespass these laws, right? His father did. Now the Gemara asks, is this verse applicable only in the cases discussed until here and no further? It is logical that the heir does not need to return the interest that was prohibited by Torah law. All the more so, the heir should not need to return the interest that was prohibited by rabbinic law. So, because we're more stringent in violations of Torah law than we are in violations of rabbinic decree, usually. Now, rather, Rava said, even in the cases discussed until here, one can apply the verse, the wicked may prepare and the righteous shall don. And the Gemara comments, until here, excuse me, just one second, I'll be right back. Guess I hadn't closed my office door properly and the wind blew it open. Okay. So, the Gemara comments, until here, the Tana cites cases of fixed interest, i.e. where the amount to be paid as interest was fixed at the time of the loan, which is prohibited by Torah law. And from this point forward in our Mishnah, the Tana cites cases with only a hint of interest, which is prohibited by rabbinic law. As there is no fixed sum paid as interest, but rather there are these possibilities built into the transaction that could cause interest to end up being paid. So Rabbi Lazar says, fixed interest can be removed from the lender's possession by means of legal proceedings adjudicated by judges. So in other words, if two Jews enter into an agreement, one to lend and the other to borrow money, and by agreement, when the borrower pays it back, he's going to pay more than he borrowed, which is just a classic interest-bearing loan. So they have violated this Torah law. If they do that, and then the borrower borrowed, and then the borrower paid back with interest, so the court can step in and have the interest returned to the borrower because they violated this Torah law. By contrast, in cases of a hint of interest, which is prohibited by rabbinic law, the money that was paid as interest cannot be removed by means of legal proceedings adjudicated by judges. Rabbi Yochanan says, even fixed interest cannot be removed by means of legal proceedings adjudicated by judges. And Rabbi Yitzhak says, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan? Why would he say that even in a violation of Torah law, a rabbinic court cannot step in and undo the transaction that resulted in a transfer of an interest payment? It is, as the verse states, from Ezekiel 18:13. He has given forth with neshech, interest, and he took tarbit, increase. So he has given forth with neshech, and he took tarbit. Shall he live? He shall not live. He performed all these abominations. He shall be executed. His blood shall be upon him. Now, lending at interest to another Jew is not a death penalty offense. So what's Ezekiel saying? Now, it can be inferred that one who takes interest is subject to death, not at the hands of an earthly court, but at the hand of heaven, right? That this will actually result in him having his own life shortened because it is, might not be a death penalty offense in an earthly court, but it is a big transgression if one does not atone. Subject to death at the hand of heaven, but not to repayment, right? So in other words, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is, well, if you do this, what you have won for yourself is that, you're going to have your life shortened unless you make an atonement for this because of charis, right? Death at the hands of the heavenly court. And if indeed the penalty is death at the hands of the heavenly court, which is often understood to be a shortened human life, well, then we don't have two penalties. It's not also that the earthly court steps in and reverses the transfer of money. Citing a different proof, Rav Ada bar Ahava said that the verse states, "You shall not take from him neshek or tarbit. You shall fear your God, and your brother shall live with you." That's Leviticus 25:36. And it can be inferred that one who does so, who lends at interest, is subject to shirking the fear of heaven, but not to repayment. right? So one who, and this is sort of the same philosophy as the difference between a robber and a thief, right? Where the thief, when he makes restitution, has the double payment, and a robber only has to add 20% as the penalty. So it's like thievery is worse than robbery. Why? Because the robber does so brazenly, right? So the person knows who robbed him. So therefore, the robber does what he does before God and man. The thief, the victim doesn't know who the thief was. So he's sneaky. So he thinks that he's going to get away with it because people don't know what he did, as if the fact that God knows what he did is unimportant, right? It's brazen in the sense that he does not fear God, he only fears people, and that's why he sneaks around, right? And so that's this idea of shirking the fear of heaven. So one who becomes guilty of shirking fear of heaven, thinks he got away with stuff in this world because no one knows he did it, only God knows, his penalty is worse. Now, Rava said it can be derived, this idea that the court doesn't go in and extract payment. The Rava said it can be derived from the verse in Ezekiel itself, not by inference. As it is written, he shall be executed, his blood shall be upon him. So in the verse, lenders who charged interest were juxtaposed with people who shed blood. And this teaches just as shedders of blood are not subject to repayment, they're subject to execution, they're murderers, right? So too, lenders who charge interest are not subject to repayment. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Elazar that interest prohibited by Torah law can indeed be reclaimed by means of legal proceedings adjudicated by a rabbinic court? It is, and the proof is, as the verse concerning prohibition against taking interest states, and your brother shall live with you, right? That's a continuation of the verse that prohibits lending at interest in Leviticus 25:36. And from this we derive, and your brother shall live with you, therefore return the interest to him so that he may live, right? And the concept being that somebody who needs to borrow money, right, as he's a needy person, right? And so if you are charging him interest, you are taking away from somebody who really needs it, potentially, so he doesn't starve, right? And so that's why charging interest is considered such a serious offense. We are on page 62a now. And so the Gemara asks, in Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the rabbinic court cannot extract the interest from somebody who received it, the Gemara asks, in Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with this verse, and your brother shall live with you? And the Gemara answers, he requires the verse for that which is taught in a baraisa. In other words, he uses it for a totally different purpose. Your brother, he shall live with you. He uses it for this very, very different law, which is actually a very classic type of teaching situation from the Talmud. Very classic story, the dilemma of two in the desert with only enough water for one of them to survive. So Rabbi Yochanan uses the verse, and your brother shall live with you, for that which is taught in the Baraisa. If two people were walking on a desolate path, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, and the situation was such that if both drink water from the jug, both of them will die, as there is not enough water for them to reach civilization. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach civilization. So what do we do in that situation? What is the law? What should they do according to halacha? So there is a dispute. Ben Petora taught it is preferable that both of them drink and die, and let neither of them see the death of the other, right? Here we're worried about if you survive, you survived, but you know that you survived at the expense of your brother. And perhaps the trauma of that and the guilt of that will make the rest of your life, so difficult that it would have been better if the two of you just died together. Now, instinctively, we feel like that's wrong, but they didn't have a proof for why it was wrong until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that the verse that we're talking about here, and your brother shall live with you, indicating that your life takes precedence over the life of the other. You have to do everything for your brother, but if saving your brother costs you your life, then you don't have to save your brother. Now, this is all predicated on the idea that there's two people in the desert, one of them has a jug of water, right? It's not that they have a jug of water. One of them has possession of that jug of water. So the question is, the one that has water, does he have to share it with the other one, if knowing that if he does so, both of them will die? So Rabbi Akiva says, no. When it's him or you, and you have the water, it's a tragic situation. We all pray that would never happen. But if that does happen, then you have to preserve yourself so that at least one of you will walk out of the desert. Now, there's an interesting note here. The Netziv and the Chazon Ish both explain that the circumstance is such that if both drink, the water will suffice to help them survive for a limited duration. Now, this is trying to explain the original opinion of Ben Petora that they should split the water, even if it means both of them will die. Why would we ever hold that way? Because it is possible that they will then find another water source or some other means of deliverance during that time. If only one of them drinks, it is more likely that he will be saved, but the other one will certainly die. If the limited amount of water would not suffice to keep them both alive, even for that amount of time, right, time to find some alternative water source, then all agree that the owner of the water may drink it himself. So, it's not that as soon as we get into this life and death situation, it's like all for me and sorry, dude, I got to save myself. You have to really try and exhaust every other possibility, but only when it becomes a certainty that if you share the water, you're both going to die, and if you don't, you're going to live, would you take that option? Now, the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa to the opinion that one is not obligated to return interest that he took. That's what we've been talking about, right? They only went to the, the detour for a moment, the digression for a moment on the two in the desert, just because Rabbi Yochanan uses, and your brother shall live with you, for the same reason that Rabbi Akiva says it, your brother shall live with you, but not die with you, right? But now we're back to the question, if a Jew charges another Jew interest on a loan and the interest was paid, can a rabbinic court step in and extract that interest from the lender and return it to the borrower? So the Gemara raised an objection from Baraisa to the opinion that one is not obligated to return interest that he took. If their father bequeathed them money that he had collected as interest, even though his sons know that the money was collected as interest, they are not obligated to return the money. And the Gemara infers, but this indicates that their father himself is obligated to return the money. Now the Gemara rejects the inference. By right, it should have said that their father is also not obligated to return the money. Like the Jew who borrowed at interest, the Jew who lent at interest, the scribe who wrote up the contract, and the witnesses who enabled it to be written have all violated Torah laws. If they all, were party to an agreement in which money was going to be lent at a fixed sum of interest. So they all have a sin upon them that they need to atone for. Etc. If any of them did it unwittingly, when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, they would bring a chatas, a sin offering. In the absence of the temple and offerings, they have to make other kinds of atonement for committing this sin. The question is, can a court step in and force the one who took the interest to return it? Now, certainly, if he's making atonement, he should return the interest. The question is, can he be forced to do so? Right? So by right, it should have said that their father is also not obligated to return the money. But since the Tana wants to teach the latter clause, which states, if their father bequeathed to them a cow or a garment or any defined item that was stolen property, they are obligated to return it to its owner due to their obligation to uphold their father's honor. So then the Tana also taught the first clause with regard to their obligation and not that of their father. So it's interesting that if somebody inherits stolen goods, that they need to return. If they inherit money, some of which was received by the father who violated the prohibition on lending money to interest, that the heirs don't need to return. Now the Gemara asks, and these children, are they obligated to take action due to the obligation to uphold their father's honor? Read and apply here the verse, nor curse a ruler of your people, Exodus 22:27, from which it is inferred that this prohibition applies only to one who performs an action becoming of your people, meaning the actions of the father who lent money with interest were unbecoming of the Jewish people. Why then must his sons uphold his honor? Right? To the idea of upholding your father's honor, well, if he stole and now you're going to return what he stole, did you really uphold your father's honor? I mean, you're just saying that you want to be an honest person. But maybe what you're saying is that your father regretted it, meant to return it, didn't have an opportunity, and so here I'm returning it to you. And maybe you could say the same for interest. Now the Gemara explains, it is, as Rabbi Pinchas said in the name of Rav in a different context, that it is referring to a case where the father repented. So here too, it is a case where the father repented, and therefore he was righteous and worthy of respect. And the Gemara asks, if he repented, what is the stolen item doing in his possession? And the Gemara answers, it is a case where the father did not manage to return the item before he died. So consequently, the children must return the item in order to uphold their father's honor. And the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa concerning robbers and those who lend money with interest. Even though they collected the money, they must return it. So the Gemara analyzes the language of the Baraisa. In the case of robbers, what case is there that can be described as even though they collected the money? They didn't collect money, they robbed. If they robbed, they robbed. And it is imprecise to use the language of collecting money. If they did not rob, do you call them robbers? Rather, say in explanation of the Baraisa, robbers. In this context, who are they? They are those who lend with interest. And even though they collected the money, they must return it. So evidently, money collected as interest, right, in a fixed sum interest-bearing transaction that directly violates written Torah law, the court can step in and force the lender to return the interest that he collected. And using the language of a robber who has to cough it up. Now the Gemara answers, in fact, this issue is a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Nehemiah and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov exempt the lender and the guarantor from lashes for violating the prohibition of interest. Because although they violated a prohibition, once they have done so, they are commanded to arise and take action. And there is a principle that one is not flogged for a transgression that can be rectified by the performance of a mitzvah. And the Gemara clarifies, what mitzvah to arise and take action is there? Is it not due to the fact that we say to them, arise and return the money? So from the opinion of these sages, it can be derived by inference that the first Tana holds that these people are not subject to the obligation of repayment. So apparently he holds that there is no mitzvah to arise and take action and give back the interest that you charged. And the Gemara rejects that inference. No. What is the mitzvah to arise and take action? It is the mitzvah to tear up the promissory note documenting the commitment to pay interest. You can arise and stop this transaction from moving forward. But once it's finished, that doesn't mean that you are able to fix the fact that you borrowed or lended at interest, and that the money changed hands and the deal was finished, right? There was a borrowing and then there was a repayment with interest. At that point, you're not able to fix it simply by returning the money, right? There's more atoning to do than just that. The question is, well, if they were warned not to do this and they did it anyway, and so flogging would come into it, are we going to say that, well, no, we're going to set the flogging aside because it's like a fix-it ticket, right? Like if you have a broken headlight, you don't have to pay the fine if you get the light fixed. Or if you have expired tags, you don't have to pay the fine if you just go and renew the tags. Is it like that? Or is it that once you've done it, there is a flogging and we don't step in and take the money out, right? That's the question they're asking. So the Gemara asks, what is accomplished by tearing up the document? What does this Tana hold? If he holds that the legal status of the debt in a document that is fit to be collected is as though it were already collected, and accordingly they already performed their transgression by writing the document, then they accomplish nothing by tearing it, as the very act of writing the document is tantamount to collecting the debt. And if the legal status of the debt in a document that is fit to be collected is not legally considered as though it were already collected, then by tearing up the document, they have done nothing so long as the interest has not yet changed hands from the borrower to the lender. Either way, tearing up the document doesn't change anything. So the Gemara answers, actually, this Tana holds that the legal status of the debt in a document that is fit to be collected is not legally considered as though it were already collected. And he teaches us the following principle. The appraisal of an item's value is a significant matter. If a document was written for a loan with interest and the debtor's property was appraised as collateral, this itself is a significant matter, and it is punishable with lashes. Again, if you were warned and you did it anyway, it would be a flogging offense. So the Gemara comments, so too it is reasonable to explain the matter this way. As we learned in the Mishna on page 75b, and these individuals violate the prohibition of interest, the lender, the borrower, the guarantor, and the witnesses. And the Gemara asks, granted, with regard to all of them, the lender, the borrower, and the guarantor, it is understood that they violate the prohibition as they performed an action. But with regard to the witnesses, what did they do to render themselves liable? Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from the Mishnah that the appraisal of an item's value is a significant matter, since the Mishnah states that the witnesses whose testimony enables appraisal participate in the transgression? This proves that appraisal is significant, and the Gemara affirms, conclude from the Mishnah that this is so. And the halacha, the way it came out on this, it is prohibited to borrow or lend money on items with interest, and it is likewise prohibited to act as a middleman or assist in a loan of this kind. The lender violates 6 prohibitions, the borrower violates 2, and the guarantor and the witnesses 1 each. Whoever aids them in any other manner transgresses the verse, you shall not place a stumbling block before the blind. Right? So if you in any way enable a loan at interest which violates this prohibition to move forward between 2 Jews, then you become guilty of placing a stumbling block before the blind. And if you're more directly participating in it, then you become liable for violating even more prohibitions. So Rav Safra says, according to the opinion that the lender is compelled to return the money that was paid as interest, these are the rules to be employed. In any case where the obligation recorded in the document is so clear that by the laws of the Gentiles, who are not prohibited from collecting interest, one removes the interest from the possession of the borrower to give it to the lender, then by our Jewish laws, one returns the interest from the lender to the borrower. Right? In other words, if the contract for this loan and the subsequent repayment at some increased rate is so clear that you understand what the number was. This is how much money is being lent. This is how much is going to be paid back. This is the difference, which is being charged as interest, right? So that would be an enforceable contract, right, in any court in the world. So when it's that clear, then by Jewish law, if the Jews entered into that agreement and the one borrowed and paid back with the interest, now a rabbinic court can step in and extract the interest from the lender and return it to the borrower. Or maybe, I guess they return it to the borrower. Remember that the borrower also committed a transgression, but the lender's transgression was greater since he profited from it. So I guess it's when it's extracted from him, it is returned to the borrower. And this is going to be contrasted with where we're talking about like a bushel of wheat being, purchased, an agreement, borrowing the bushel today, returning it next week, right? In some, in any civil court, that would be like, so there's nothing wrong with that. It's unclear exactly what the amount is, but that's not an amount where it's clear what interest is being paid. Right? This is more that hint of interest that depending on market prices, etc., this is not clearly an interest-bearing loan. So where it's not clearly an interest-bearing loan that would have been enforced in a civil court, then the rabbinic court does not step in and extract any kind of extra payment that the lender made, even though he violated the law on the rabbinic decrees against interest and ribis. Nonetheless, the rabbinic court would not step in and extract that increase from the lender. And in any case where the agreement is not unequivocal, and by their laws, the laws of the Gentiles, one does not remove the interest from the possession of the borrower to give to the lender, then by our laws, one does not return the interest from the lender to the borrower. So Abaye said to Rav Yosef, and is it an established principle that applies in all cases? But there is the case where one lent a sa of produce for the return of a sa of the same type of produce, the example we keep mentioning, and the price of the produce went up in the interim, where by their laws, one removes the interest from the possession of the borrower to give to the lender, and yet by our laws, one does not return the interest from the lender to the borrower, as taking this type of interest is not prohibited by Torah law, only by rabbinic decree. Now, what they're saying is, well, yeah, in a civil court, if you said to them, I borrowed a bushel of wheat, and I said that in 1 month I would return a bushel of wheat. So in their court, that would be enforceable, right? You would take from the borrower what he promised to pay, this bushel, and give it to the lender. Now, if the price went up in the meantime, that would be irrelevant. You would extract from the borrower what he promised to pay and give that to the lender. So that is unequivocally an enforceable and very clear contract. And yet, we just said that by rabbinic decree, this violates rabbinic decree, not Torah law, and therefore the rabbinic court would not step in and reverse, the difference that the bushel at the time of repayment was worth more, and so you would extract the extra value that reflects the increase in market price and give that back to the borrower. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, but there is the case. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. So that's the objection. That what I just said. So Rav Yosef answered him: the Gentiles do not consider that kind of transaction a loan. Rather, according to their laws, it entered the possession of the borrower with the status of a deposit, and consequently returning the produce is not considered repayment of a loan with interest, even though its value is greater than it was at the outset. Because at least in this time and place, such a transaction was not considered a loan at all in civil courts. It was considered the return of a deposit. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, okay, here's a different example. There is the case of a mortgage without deduction, where the debtor's field is held by the creditor as collateral until the debt is repaid. And while the lender is holding the field, the lender is allowed to consume the produce of the field without deducting from the debt the value of the produce he consumed, right? Since he's getting a stream of income, the produce, from the collateral itself, that's almost exactly the same as the borrower is paying interest until he can return the money that he borrowed and get his field back. How is that not interest? And the consumption of the produce constitutes a type of interest. And in that case, by the laws of the Gentiles, one removes the interest from the possession of the borrower to give to the lender, because that's what they agreed to. And yet, now we're on 62b, by our laws, right, by Jewish law, one does not return the interest from the lender to the borrower. We don't step in and unwind this transaction, even though it violates ribbis, because it violates ribbis by rabbinic decree, not by Torah law. Since the interest was not fixed from the outset, they didn't know how much produce would be produced by this field, and there is also no certainty that he will consume any produce. This is merely a case of a hint of interest. So Rav Ashi said to him, the Gentiles do not consider this kind of transaction alone. Rather, they see this as a case where the field came into his possession by means of a transaction in the form of a sale. The field was temporarily sold to the lender, who sells it back to the borrower when the debt is paid. But the Gentiles would not characterize this as a loan. So the Gemara asks, but if one is a case of a deposit and the other is the case of a sale, so the principle that begins with any case whereby their laws that Rav Safra was saying is our principle, so what is he coming to teach us? And the Gemara answers that this is what he is coming to teach us. In any case where, by the Gentile laws, one removes interest from the possession of the borrower to give to the lender, by our laws, one returns the interest from the lender to the borrower. And what is that case? It is a case of fixed interest, and it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. In other words, where you stated, I'm borrowing this much money, I'm going to pay back that money plus a certain amount of interest. That is enforceable in the Gentile courts as an interest-bearing loan, and it would be reversed in a Jewish court because Jews are not allowed to lend an interest to each other. And as for the statement that in any case where their laws, one does not remove the interest from the possession of the borrower to give to the lender, then by our laws, one does not return the interest from the lender to the borrower. What is this referring to? A case of prior interest, i.e. interest paid prior to the granting of a loan in order to induce the lender to grant the loan. And subsequent interest, i.e. a gift given after a loan has been repaid to show thanks to the lender for lending the money. Although paying these types of interest is prohibited, they are not actually part of the agreement. By our laws, one does not compel the lender to return those payments, right? So a gift, somebody is so grateful that his friend is going to lend him $1,000 that he gives him his tickets to the game. That's not considered an interest payment, and we wouldn't unwind that. So the Mishnah teaches, back to the Mishnah, new subject, going back to the Mishnah, and this complicated example of where one pays for wheat is going to take delivery later, but before he takes delivery of the wheat, the price of the wheat goes up, and then he says, give me the wheat now, I want to turn it in, because I want to sell it and purchase wine. And the one who's going to deliver the wheat says, well, you know what, since what you want to do is purchase wine, okay, so I have wine, or I don't have wine, but I can get it for you. So now at the new price of wheat, consider that a credit with me, and instead of delivering wheat to you, I'll deliver wine to you, but it's going to be priced at the new market price of the wheat, not what they originally agreed at the time that the money changed hands, and that this creates ribis, right? This creates interest. So going back to that case, the Mishnah taught, how so? So for example, one acquired wheat from another at the price of 1 core of wheat for 1 gold dinar, which is worth 25 silver dinars, with the wheat to be supplied at a later date. And such was the market price of wheat at the time he acquired it. And the price of a core of wheat then increased and stood at 30 dinars. It increased from 25 to 30. So at that point, the buyer said to the seller, give me all of my wheat now, as I wish to sell it and purchase wine with it. And the seller said to him, each core of your wheat is considered by me to be worth 30 dinars, the current market price, and you have the right to collect its value in wine from me. And in this case, the seller does not have wine in his possession. So the seller is considered to be a borrower with regard to the lender, who is viewed as lending the wheat to the seller. So the Gemara asks about this whole complicated transaction. And if the supplier of wheat does not have any wine on hand, what of it? Why is this factor relevant? But isn't it taught in a baraisa? When purchasing produce to be collected by the buyer at a later stage, one may not set a price for the produce until the market rate is publicized. If the rate has been publicized, then one may set a price, despite the fact that the seller is not actually in possession of any such produce, as even though this seller does not have any of that produce, some other seller does, which the first seller could go and purchase at that market rate. So evidently, once the market rate is publicized, the transaction is considered a purchase and not a loan with interest, even if the buyer does not receive the produce immediately. So Rabbah said, in the Mishna, we are dealing with one who comes to incur a debt for their value. What does this mean? For the value of the wine. If the borrower, i.e. the seller, possessed wine at that time, he would have transferred it to the lender, i.e. the buyer, in place of the wheat, and this would have constituted a proper sale. Since he did not possess any wine, he promised it to the seller at a later date for a higher price, and this constituted a loan with interest as opposed to a sale, because they originally agreed to a sale of wheat at 25 silver dinars for the core. It went up to 30 silver dinars for the core. The wheat still hasn't been delivered, but the seller of the wheat says, okay, I'll get you wine for that price since that's what you really want. And that's why he now becomes a borrower, because he hasn't made good on the wheat he has to deliver, and he's going to go out and get wine. And since he originally agreed to sell at 25 and now he has to deliver at 30, this is why it became a loan with interest. And this is as it is taught in a baraisa. If a person was owed, I'm almost done, so questions or comments, please get them in now. And this is as it is taught in a baraisa. If a person was owed 100 dinars by another, and he went and stood by the other's granary and said to him, give me my money, as I wish to buy wheat with it. And the debtor said to him, I have wheat in my granary that I will give you. Go and calculate for me the amount of wheat to which you are entitled by the current market rate, and I will give you this amount of wheat over the span of a full 12 months, even if the price rises in the interim. So such a practice is forbidden because of interest, as this is not similar to a case where his Issar has come into his possession, since the lender did not give the borrower even a single Issar as payment for the wheat. This is not a sale, but rather a loan with interest. So Abaye said to Rabbah, if this transaction is forbidden because it is not similar to a case where his Issar has come into his possession, why does the Mishnah specifically teach the case where he does not have wine? Even if he does have wine, it would also be forbidden, as he gave no money at the time of the acquisition. So rather, Abaye rejected Rabbah's explanation and said the Mishnah should be understood like the baraisa taught by Rav Safra with regard to the laws of interest, which was taught originally in the school of Rabbi Chia. As Rav Safra taught a baraisa from the school of Rabbi Chia with regard to interest. And we're going to get to Rav Safra's understanding of what's permitted and what's prohibited tomorrow, God willing, at our regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay. Sharon, didn't we learn before that you can't do an advance sale unless the seller already had it in his possession to avoid the profit-making possibility, or am I misremembering? Yeah, I mean, you got it. Yes, like exactly, because of this kind of a problem. Now there's also the different issue of where the money changes hands and you haven't yet received the wheat, so there has been no formal act of acquisition. So the seller, right, he's the one liable in case something goes wrong. But there we were only talking about acquisition and not this possibility that the market rate fluctuates. Since the market rate fluctuates and you paid money, and then at the time of delivering the produce, you might be delivering something that is now worth more, it would start to amount to a loan with interest rather than a sale with a delayed delivery. But this is not some kind of fixed interest loan, right, where it's clearly violating a Torah prohibition. It's more that there's the hint of interest that could develop over the course of such a transaction, and so it would violate a rabbinic decree. And even if the parties agreed to it, we would later tell them, okay, and they did it, and everything is finished. We would say to them, you shouldn't have done that. You violated a prohibition. You should atone for that. But we wouldn't extract the payment in the same way that we would if they had agreed to a fixed interest type of loan. And fixed interest, not as like when we talk about mortgages and variable rates, where we're just talking about that they agreed that more money would be paid than was initially lent, no matter what the mathematical formula was. If the point is that they agreed to some greater amount of money being repaid than what was borrowed, then that violates the Torah law. Now, Nina's giving me a note that Joseph asked 2 questions and Bill answered. I forget how we answered the accusation that the Talmud allows usury of Gentiles. And Bill said, strictly speaking, the consensus of the law is that it's allowed because the plain text of the Torah says that one may not loan at interest to a brother. Exactly. However, from time to time in the modern era, late 1700s till now, some authorities have proposed that one should avoid doing so as a form of Kiddush Hashem. Right. But also remember that there's nothing inherently wrong with this. Like usury, terrible sounding word, right? But, borrowing money to buy a house, something that everybody does, and then borrowing money to start a business is something so many people do, and it enables the economy to work and people to prosper and people to get businesses off the ground, right? And, strangers at arm's length lending to each other, that's not going to happen if there's not something in it for the lender. And this is, and I believe, Bill, you'll let me know, isn't that Christians can't lend to each other sort of for the same reason? And so what ended up happening is that Jews, in many societies historically, who were not permitted to own land because of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, were permitted to lend money at interest, though they couldn't do it to each other. They could lend to non-Jews. And then that was good for the Jews and good for the locals until the locals figured, well, you know what? If we get rid of these Jews, we won't have to pay back our loans. And then suddenly they have a flash of Jew hatred and a pogrom, and Jews are killed and other Jews flee. And those liars and thieves who were hiding behind Jew hatred to really just escape their loans, I mean, tragically, that kind of thing happened many times in different places in history. But the bottom line, and there's also the idea that sometimes, right, like usury not allowed, hint of interest not allowed, but certain kinds of businesses just required this. And then just like there was the prosbul, that wasn't about lending at interest, that was about lending at all, right? That sometimes you would lend to somebody just to help them get on their feet, but you also had the issue that under the law of the Shemitah year, every 7 years, all debts would be canceled, right? When the temple was standing. And then the people who were really needy couldn't get a loan at all as the 7th year was approaching. So they came up with a device that enabled them to borrow because the debt would not be owed to their fellow. It would be owed to the rabbinic court. Now, I don't know enough about this at all to say this, but I seem to have some dim recollection that there are, business ventures and partnerships which really aren't about lending at interest to your fellow, but where these hints of interest issues could come into it. But if we're going to be so strict to the letter of the law, it would really hamper business. And so then you had rabbinic courts step in and say, okay, well, this kind of partnership, this kind of LLC, this kind of LLP, and there are still people today, who are from like really religious Jews that will consult with the rabbinic court before they get involved in business ventures. And if there's going to be this hint of interest issue, then they be sure to frame it legally so that they don't violate these kinds of prohibitions. And as we've seen already, we've really only dealt with rather simple cases, and yet it already got pretty complicated. And when you get into really complex transactions, forget about it, right? It can get really, really heavy. We've also seen that this was, basically these laws were meant to be applied in not just like a Jewish community within, somebody else's country, but really it was meant to be applied in Israel when Torah law was sovereign there and everybody was subject to it. Now, that Jews are trying to make a living, in a wider and scary world, again, the rabbinic courts would help them, be able to make a living and not run afoul of these laws by clarifying, when hint of interest is going to kick in and when it doesn't. And this is just part of kind of the economic history that's been in play since, the diaspora began. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. There's so much more to this, but we're just getting started. So God willing, see you tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.